Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Sip and Scholar, a podcast where we uncork new knowledge. Today, I am joined by Dr. Molly Apple, who is an amazing professor, a really good friend, and the best happy hour companion.
We all have our skill sets.
And your current faculty senate chair at NSU.
Yes. Help.
Help is here.
Yeah.
Cheers, friend.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yay. So today we're sipping on some, what is this, a Malibu?
I learned it as a Malibu con piña. It's a throwback to the first ever beverage I ordered legally at a bar when I was 18 and living my, later I learned it was called gap year in Spain, working as an au pair.
What? I didn't know that. No
surprise. Yes. Instead of going right to college, I made a deal with my parents that if I accepted enrollment somewhere and deferred for a year, I could go and have a different experience of learning. I had wanted to kind of take a break from schooling for a little while, and then so I was 18 and it sounds like really glamorous, probably like, oh, I lived in Spain when I was 18 for so long. But it was really a year of like learning to be by myself a little bit and kind of like with my own thoughts and wonderings about the world. But I did meet a couple of other au pairs who took me out to a bar, which I had never legally
been allowed to
been
do here in the U.S.
in the U.S. And so I had no idea what to order.
Yeah.
And the girl I was with was like, oh, you'll love this. It's a Malibu con piña. And ever since, it just makes me so nostalgic. And it's extremely drinkable.
It is very drinkable. And once you're drinking it, you can see why it's the drink for an 18-year-old.
Yeah. 18-year-old basic B white girl, like out there.
I know. I remember like when I was like a teen, the drink of choice was like a Smirnoff. Yeah. I would not. No, do not give me a Smirnoff.
Or things that we subject ourselves to.
Or I thought it was really cool to like go up to the bartender and be like, I want to sex on the beach.
And you think you're like, I'm the most adult ever.
Look
and they're
at
like, okay.
Yeah, living my Sex and the City fantasy. No.
That was later when I lived in New York.
Oh, okay, well, whatever.
Ooh, yeah.
No,
well, I am a longtime listener, longtime fan of, well, you certainly, and this podcast especially.
You're
Longtime
too
listener,
sweet.
first time caller.
Oh my God, I love
you
that.
should cut that.
Awesome. Oh my God, that is too funny. Okay, so you are currently working as an assistant professor of English, but you never actually studied English. So
That's
can you
correct.
tell us about that journey and what that was like?
Yeah, it's really funny to me to have ended up with, I think, what for many of my humanities grad school colleagues would say is like the lottery win, right?
Yeah.
A tenure track job in an English program, etc. And it's just strange to me because I think I told you, I'm like, I never actually majored in English at any point in my career. And
what were your majors in?
It was it's funny. So I mentioned that I took a gap year between high school and going to college where I lived and worked first on the southern coast of Spain.
Yeah.
And then I moved to Madrid and just kind of, excuse me, see, I'm already like drinking the drink. Here we go. I moved to Madrid and worked there and kind of got really interested in language and different even forms of English and Spanish because I worked in a very Spanish family with like the capital S, and but worked around because being an au pair, for listeners who may not be familiar, means you are essentially a full-time nanny for your kids, and so it usually comes with a certain level of wealth to have that. I think often in the United States, U.S. American families will like bring their French teenager over to whatever, spend time with their kids, and they learn another language. And so I was doing that with English. But I also, I remember an Ecuadorian woman who would come and cook for the family, and we would chat during the off times. And whenever I heard her call her family back in Ecuador, she would use usted with her kids, which is the formal, for listeners if they're not familiar with Spanish, it's the formal you terminology, usually something that you use at a distance. And getting to kind of ask her about what that usage meant to her for how she formed a relationship with her kids versus other people around in the household, really it just kind of got me interested in language and storytelling kind of across nations, and not sort of stuck in one particular like English or Spanish. So when I got to college, I tried a multitude of majors. I went to Skidmore College, which is a small private liberal arts in upstate New York, and had about 2,000 students.
Oh, wow.
Slack, I think, is the term for it. And, I looked into majoring in Spanish, or I think I took like 1 or 2 English classes, but I was also interested in anthropology and psychology, and Skidmore had a program where you could design your own major.
Oh,
and you had
awesome.
it was an interesting experience. You had to like fully propose a program just like any other professor would. So I had to go in front of the curriculum committee, and it had to be approved as a sort of one-off degree, essentially. And so the major I made up was in mythology and folklore.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it. Tell me more.
So this is a very long-winded way, and you can tell I'm an English professor because everything I do and say is long-winded. But so what that allowed me to do, I think I was really interested in story and language, in how it worked to kind of, often when people talk about that's a myth, it means it's something that's untrue or it's false, when really historically and culturally over time, myths are the things that organize our thinking about each other and about cultures. They're kind of the cultural archive in some way.
That's true. Like the myth of La Llorona? Like that,
La Llorona is a
right?
great example.
Yeah.
Any kind of mythology, I think when I was a kid and growing up, I loved reading, the Greek pantheon, and you had the different sort of trans-Mesoamerican pantheon of gods and myths, but they sort of function in that, like La Llorona still does today, I think in Southwestern and Chicano and Mexican American cultures, but so that's what got me interested in that. And then like way late in my career, I learned there was a field called comparative literature that I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. But then I became a teacher. And I was a teacher for 4 years in New York City, in Washington Heights in the Bronx.
Okay.
And my licensure was for English as a second language, which I think now it's not even used, that terminology now. But I worked with English language learners from all over the world. And never really lost my interest in that, but I think my time with those students and working in those schools really shaped how I think about what role different sort of myths or organizing ideas, organizing fictions have in our lives, and what role they play in how we approach education as teachers and as learners. And so I didn't I had a hard time making that decision to leave my students and my colleagues, but I did want to see if someone would let me in to grad school. Yeah. And so comparative literature, I was trained as a inter-Americanist is what the term is, which means you're looking at literatures and histories across the American region.
Okay. So that includes like the
North,
South,
Central, South America.
Yeah. Okay.
Sometimes we throw El Caribe in there. Sometimes we leave it to be its own thing. But, with the investment being in being able to look at central questions or themes or concepts across their exchange, across their transnational histories. And so I ended up applying for jobs that were in English departments and Spanish departments, different versions of that, and landing at Nevada State in some ways was like the perfect amalgamation of all the Mollies that came before.
You have academic Molly, you have teacher Molly.
Yeah.
Yes, you have au pair Molly.
Au pair Molly. Let's not forget her. Thank you, au pair Molly.
That's awesome. Okay.
So that's kind of, and it's interesting to land in an English
and the comparative
program.
literature program. Was it part of an English department?
No, it was its own school, its own program.
Oh,
and so what we would do, so my grad colleagues were people from all over the world. I was in seminars with students who were investigating medieval theater in, China and Japan, or, photography and film in Romania and Brazil. And so, but what brought us together were the kind of common methods and sort of approaches to looking at concepts, and always that sort of translingual locus. And so, but sometimes, you would wander off and be like, I'm going to take a seminar in the English department here, or like in the Spanish department over here. But it was at Penn State, and so it's its own field, which always, I feel like a lot of these fields have their own like identity crisis built in. But
Oh, okay.
So that's how and like being in an English department. Luckily, I did have some experience with teaching writing and composition while I was in graduate school, plus from being a teacher. And I think that's probably what really helped me get this job, because we're invested in that.
I think it's so important too that you have that K-12 experience, because we teach so many students in the English department who do want to become secondary English teachers, right? And you're the to-go person for that, because you have that experience.
Thing to teach. And I think a lot still today about what's my role in, like, obviously helping to prepare our teachers, but I think in some ways changing how we think about who are the practitioners and intellectuals of the work that we do. I think, and I've been talking about this with you just put together a wonderful PD day through the School of Education that I think brought a lot of different folks from different corners of education in Clark County together in a really productive way. And I think so much more often we need to be checking ourselves in the academia side on, are we talking about teachers without teachers? Are we engaging with teachers' knowledge and pedagogical expertise in the same way? Or are we looking at them like, we have all of the expertise that needs to hierarchically come down upon them. And so I think about that a lot in how I prepare. I get to help prepare, our Clark County teachers. I like to fantasize that I have like a dual appointment in the School of Ed and School of
you kind of
Liberal Arts.
You kind of do, though. No. So I know that one of the areas that you study and that you also teach about is testimonio. Right? So what is testimonio, first of all, right? And what are some ways that you have approached in your research testimonio and in your teaching as well?
Such a good question asker. Testimonio is something I came across first while I was trying to put together a sort of capstone research project for my mythology and folklore major. I had two wonderful educators who have since moved on from Skidmore into other lofty positions or whatever, who introduced me to two texts that continue to be, I think, pivotal to my thinking and my teaching. And one is Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú. Rigoberta Menchú, which is known as one of the kind of pivotal testimonios, and I'll get to that. Sorry, the roundabout response, as well as Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, La Frontera, and so I started to, because I was interested in how authors who engage with different sort of genres of storytelling, we could say. We have like a novel, right, is one sort of genre, and we kind of know what to expect and how to position ourselves as readers when we read a novel.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting history there that I got to learn more about in my dissertation research around literature and human rights, that talks about how the novel trains us to think about ourselves and who counts as a person in particular ways. And what's so compelling about testimonio, which is formally kind of recognized as a genre that grew out of the Latin American social movements and revolutionary actions from really like the 1960s through onward. I think the big sort of productive period of that was around the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. In a parallel way that people often know from Latin American literature, they think about Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Borges, you know, these kind of like magical realism sort of ways, which became, you know, a global way of recognizing non-Western storytelling, we could say. But the testimonio purposefully breaks all of these rules. It breaks and ruptures all of the expectations we have around, when I read a novel, you know, do I see myself in the protagonist? Yeah. And it's sort of, you know, historically, you can look back to even the era of the Enlightenment, when people started writing things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in France, or the Declaration of Independence, all of these kind of big Enlightenment texts that were like, this is what it means to be a person. Yeah. And around that same time, you had novels like Robinson Crusoe starting to come out, that were also shaping the populace's imagination for how do we know what a person is? How do we conceptualize our imagination for that? And testimonio is like specifically rupturing all of the expectations around who counts as a recognized human in different cultural environments, state histories. And so one example, Rigoberta Menchú, written by, she eventually, Guatemalan Mayan woman who eventually got the Nobel Peace Prize and all of these things. And when she was in her early 20s, went into exile from the Guatemalan Civil War, which was enacted sort of this indigenous genocide. And she went to Paris and told her story. She says, my story is the story of all of my people, to a French anthropologist who then framed it into a narrative and published it around the first world, right? The sort of the global north, as people say, where audiences are very distanced from the subject matter and the people involved, but you know, the speaker, Rigoberta, has that kind of, is this sort of speaker for all of her people, as she says, for a particular experience. But that, you know, what she's doing is kind of, and what testimonios are meant to do, is to disrupt the very norms of recognition and discourses that talk about it, that make experience invisible in the first place, or make violence like genocide against the indigenous invisible in the first place. So it's a really like troublemaking kind of story that makes people uncomfortable.
And is it always based on like your real life experience, or is there testimonial that's like fiction?
Total fiction. I think traditionally in the genre, it's based in the speaker's experience.
Yeah.
And sometimes the speaker's experience is fluid between her own sort of historical experience or that of her neighbors, that of her cousins, that of her community.
Okay.
And so it's kind of operating too on a more in Western ways of thinking about what's truth and what's not. It's operating on a totally different kind of epistemology, we could say, a sort of way of thinking about personhood and knowing that is purposefully in many ways against the like what I would call like a juridical lens, a legal lens of like, is this true or not?
Yeah.
And often when I teach, right, when you teach a book about whatever, students I find will come and want to say, well, this author is biased. This author has this bias or not, and sort of bringing that lens of like, my job as a reader is to evaluate, thank you, Stephen Colbert, the truthiness of something, when testimonio is asking you to do something very different, which is to learn to sit with and listen, and to sit in discomfort, to sit in things that are contradictory. And I guess I put Gloria Anzaldúa with that because over the years since I've come to know her, our long-standing relationship, I think she very much is teaching the same thing. Did that answer your question?
It did. And it kind of made me think too that testimonial is giving a voice to people who normally don't have a voice.
Absolutely. And I should mention that, you know, historically testimonio has sort of been codified in academia through like Latin American studies scholars who are like white, you know, ivory tower, literary this, but I think that particularly Chicana feminist and Latina feminist lines of scholarship, and particularly within the sphere of education and higher education, have really adopted a new, I mean, it's not new, like from many decades, but have really, I think, demonstrated testimonio as both practice and object of study, we could say, in a way that I would like to see kind of the, you know, literary studies and Latin American studies scholars engage with a lot more. I think sometimes these are parallel lines of inquiry that could do, So I just cut myself off. Sorry.
No, I mean, I find this very, very super interesting because when I was in my PhD program, I learned about Gloria Anzaldúa, but I didn't, like, I think I maybe read like a couple chapters, but it wasn't
Was
like,
it How to Tame a Wild Tongue? That's
yeah,
usually
I loved it.
Well, I mean,
yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's often the most canonized of her pieces, and rightfully so.
Yeah. And Borderlands too. I remember there was one of her readings that talks about like the whole thing about language and feeling like she doesn't speak like the right variety of language, and talking about how language fluctuates, and how as a Chicana, you know, no soy de aquí ni soy de allá, I'm not from here, not from there, right? Like and that resonates with so many people, right? And I used part of her writing with my own undergrad and teacher preparation, because it kind of gives you
bilingual education. I mean,
and it gives you like a really good view. I think it gives people who might not understand what it's like to be bilingual, what it's like to be judged by the way that you speak both languages, like a window into how we think about language and how we feel about language. So I definitely used part of her work, but I mean, Gloria Anzaldúa's work is amazing. It's really large, and to really get to it, it's like you have that expertise for sure. And so the question that I have for you, talking about Gloria Anzaldúa, since you focus on her work, so for our listeners, could you please give us a description of her body of work and how that resonates in your field as an English professor?
I'm going to try to do that without just being like mega fangirl here the whole time. Gloria Anzaldúa, I guess somewhat of a long story short, is recognized now, and rightfully so, as a Chicana, queer, lesbian. Sometimes now, later on in her work, she identified more as patlache, which is a Nahuatl term for queer femme woman. Like patlache.
Is it free spirit? No, it's not the same thing.
Oh, like two spirit. I don't think it
no.
may be. Okay. That may be akin. I should look more into that linguistic history, but I think it may be akin to that within North American indigenous terminology. But it comes from the Mexica indigenous of that. Patlache is as a queer woman, and she grew up on the border of Texas, grew up in Brownsville, and was an educator there for a long time. Went to Pan American College, which is now
University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley.
We had a wonderful speaker at the event you held the other day who spoke to that, and she went on to write very much out of her own experience, positionality from those places. Positionality now is a term that I think that we can apply to that, but she was doing it before all of this was going on. And I think she completely trailblazed so many ways of really fundamentally, there's the concept of the borderlands, certainly. There's the concept of Nepantla, which comes from, again, Nahuatl terminology, but she really kind of theorized and offered this theory of being in between. One of my favorite lines of hers from the Borderlands first chapter or preface is, I think, this is my home, this thin edge of barbed wire, she writes, but in both loving and painful terms. And I think holding those contradictions that both tear us apart but make us who we are is precisely the theory that she, I think, introduced into the world, and is why her work shows up in so many wide varieties of places. One of the things I've gotten, thank you Nevada State, I've gotten to teach a seminar on her work, and so we read, we're reading one author really, but from Borderlands through to a collection of her early and late work to her posthumously published dissertation, Light in the Dark, Luz en lo Oscuro. And she, I have my students kind of start by looking up a key word of interest to them. Maybe it's education, maybe it's mental health, maybe it's spirituality. Go onto the library website and look up Gloria Anzaldúa and that keyword and see what they discover. And they always discover so many things because she impacted queer theory, she impacted education, she impacted rhetoric and writing studies, she impacted literary studies, she impacted
Latinx studies.
Right? I mean, right,
all
let alone
all the things.
Also, all of that foundational to Latinx, Chicana studies. And I think part of what is so compelling that I try to continue to think through is she did this as a writer, but lived it in how she built coalitions among other writers, among other women of color, particularly among other queer, femme, trans, and the different words that, we have for that now. Again, that when she lived in San Francisco in the 1980s had a lot of different attachments to it, but she did so much. She rooted her practice of writing as a practice of thinking and living. It's sort of, she refused binaries is really what she insistently introduces, and not, so distinct from so much other academic theory that we see. She's like, I'm gonna not only refuse the terms that I'm supposed to be inheriting, right? I think one of the stories is she went, and I should remember this. She went either to a comparative literature department. I think it might have been at UT Austin. Don't at me if I'm wrong. Don't get in the comments. But she was like, I want to study Chicana literature for my dissertation. They were like, that's not a real field.
Yeah.
And
now it is.
I mean, and now, like, can you, it's wonderful to say, it's hard to imagine that, but it's because of folks like her and obviously like her comadres who were refusing the refusals. And I think she teaches that across her work. And so she worked in this, Borderlands is this, like, what is it? Is it history? Is it personal narrative? Is it poetry? It's all of those things.
Yeah.
Is it theory? And it's, again, this refusal of easy, neat genres. And before that was a collection called This Bridge Called My Back, radical writings of women of color. She collaborated with Jerry Moraga, Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, other, just like luminaries of literature, and certainly of women of color writers and activists at the time. And so that was the first publication she actually had, and then went on to do Borderlands, and then she wrote children's books. She thought a lot through her artwork. It's actually a tattoo I want to get. Oh, really? Saving up the money. That has her drawing. It's a beautiful drawing of maybe I'll send you a picture of it. You can, like, put it in the I don't even know.
No, I mean, yeah, we'd love to see it.
Yeah. It's called she writes Geography of Self, and it's this woman you can see is kind of just has a naked body, but she's lying down, and you see she's drawn these, like, rivers and mountain cliffs kind of across her body in these, are they scars, are they wrinkles, are they rivers? Yeah. It's all of that, and I think that was one mode of thinking she really engaged in, which is subverts, again, totally, like, what's the standard academic way of writing and thinking about these things. So sorry, you should cut me off, because I'm just gonna keep rambling about how much I love her. Yeah.
No, I like that a lot. And I think when you were talking about Borderlands, right, it really makes me think about I think it really resonates, not only because of the topics, because of the topics discussed, but also because so many spaces share that border and those similar dynamics or very dissimilar dynamics. So, for example, when I was a Fulbright scholar in Uruguay, I did some work in the border of Uruguay and Brazil. And just looking at Portuñol, seeing the dynamics of both languages, Portuguese and Portuñol. Yes! I was like, I had never heard of Portuñol until I got there. I was like, and to sit in a classroom where a teacher was teaching in Portuñol, I was like, this is so interesting, right? And then we also have other invisible borders, like the one from Puerto Rico and the U.S., right? That you can unpack. Absolutely. And I think Gloria Anzaldúa gave us a framework that really helps us unpack those intricacies of every border, right? Even if it's different from the U.S. and Mexico border, which I would argue might be one of the more, in the Americas, violent borders that we have. Right? Compared to other places.
Pretty strong argument there.
Yeah. So,
though I mean, I think to your point, the sort of the colonial legacy of Puerto Rico and the mainland United States, I think is equally is steeped in a violence there that is not as tangibly visible.
Exactly, right?
But
like
yes.
we don't have a physical border. We don't have these. What is the new thing that they put on the rivers? Like these balls of spikes on the river. Like we don't have that, right? But there's a clear border. That's an invisible border.
And I think this is what I find so important and compelling about testimonio. And testimonio is a mode of storytelling.
Yeah.
Because if you're living in a world where you have a framework of what human beings are and look like that enables you to leave spike balls in, the Rio Grande, and have that operate in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. That is justifiable. I mean, it's
right. So what are the discursive and rhetorical frameworks that make that kind of imagination possible? And I think testimonio and work like Gloria Anzaldúa's, how she engages in borderlands thinking is essential in an era when that is possible and seems to just be more and more possible. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Super true. So
super true. Yay!
I am noticing a stark difference in the drinking level, but just pointing it out.
Wow.
That's true.
You should.
That's okay.
Time for you to monologue back at me for a little while.
Oh my God, that's funny. Okay. So one of the questions that I have for you, it's because I think Gloria Anzaldúa's work really makes you position yourself as who you are. And since you are a white educator, what are some considerations?
No, I'm just kidding.
Shocker.
Spoiler to the listeners.
So when you're approaching Anzaldúa's work as a white educator, what are some considerations that you take in mind?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's something I've thought about. I think since I, first was living in Spain through working as a white teacher in the Bronx and Washington Heights through to now. And it's funny, I was, like I said, fangirling, listening to your other episodes, not to get meta here and refer to other episodes of your podcast, but I loved hearing the way that Dr. Erika Abad was talking about otherness and insiderness and outsiderness in terms of the framework of participatory action research, which is a fundamentally decolonial mode of inquiry. And I think about that. I think one of the best lessons I ever got from, we could say, white allyship, which is fraught and always in process, was to recognize that there isn't a moment when I don't need to wake up in the morning or make a choice when I go and teach or interact with a colleague or a student that I don't need to choose anti-racism or to choose to go against the grain of which, I grow up in, right? And Dr. Marshall spoke about, structural inequities, but this is how you're trained in that. And so I think I precisely that have learned so much, I think, through Anzaldúa's insistent selfhood, insistently positioning herself with radical honesty in relation to her world. I take that model in how I need to be approaching her work. And so when I teach it, and I get to teach Gloria Anzaldúa to all of our amazing, diverse in all the ways students, right? But predominantly who are students of color, who often I'm in a position where I'm teaching them about something that they don't necessarily know, but I don't share their personal experience. And so I think coming to this work from very outward, that positionality is essential. I think if I have to start from there and move forward from that. And I think actually a project I'm sort of working on in one of my like 50 projects in my head that I'm working on, but is how Gloria Anzaldúa's work, and I think testimonio also as a genre, teaches the skills of anti-racism that are essential to even being able to listen to a story about someone whose life experience you don't share. Mm-hmm. And so I think taking from that, and I also think a lot about, especially when I am in racially, ethnically diverse spaces, and when there are other white students in the room, what does it mean for them to look at a person a white educator who engages with, hopefully, always aspirationally, but how do I, looking at work that is coming from Chicana feminism, from Gloria Anzaldúa, and speaking about how powerfully accessible and universally accessible it is without erasing the particularity of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually in itself provides a model for ways that folks who have historically benefited from the systemic inequities that cause violence against which Gloria Anzaldúa and testimonio speakers are writing, what is a pathway for that, for owning that positionality without trying to kind of like fix it in the sense of like, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying around having like a legalese reading of something versus a holding contradictions in your heart at the same time. Holding things that are in tension, listening to something that is in tension with your experience or other than your experience without trying to resolve it necessarily in a way that is comfortable for you, or without trying to just immediately like fix it without sitting in it, without sitting with the discomfort. And I think that's what
and
makes
acknowledging it,
and
right?
acknowledging
that's
it.
a lot, and that's a lot of times what happens with just with conversations, right? You might be sharing an issue and I'm over here trying to fix it and you're getting mad, right? And
and I'm like, I just wanted you to listen.
Listen to me, right? Acknowledge my feelings.
But it's true. It's very much, and I think that we, and especially like it, and that's what's hard, right? Me being like, oh my God, Vanessa, you're telling me a problem, I'm going to come up with a solution for you. That's not done out of, it's done out of care, right?
Yeah.
But that's about my comfort more than it is about what you are doing in that moment necessarily. Recognizing telling as like a critical act that in and of itself has value that we need to sit with. So I think it's a very long-winded way to talk about what I think about as a white educator of work who's, and at the same time recognizing like, what does it mean if I don't share her Chicana borderlands background. Reading Gloria Anzaldúa did, help me think about the nuances of my own sexuality, the ways that growing up as a neurodivergent is now the term person, kind of, being labeled from when I was in elementary school on as like a disabled learner, and feeling always like I'm the square peg in the round hole of educational institutions, in verbalizing spaces and experiences that don't fit in binaries. That I can enter into with genuine empathy. And so
and I think one of the most important things that we do as educators and that not a lot of educators do, is being able to position yourself and think about that critically, and how your body, how someone else's body of work or your own body of work is influenced by that background, right? And what you can draw from that. Just for example, I think for me, as you're talking, I'm thinking about my own experience too as a K-12 teacher in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
And I was a high school English teacher.
Oh, hey!
And in a public school, but I did my K-12 education in a private Catholic school. So
okay.
yeah. Yes. So I definitely did not do any of these things. Like, I was coming into this school my first year. The first year is the hardest. So that's any educators out there. Like, there's
just
definitely.
know it's just going to be hard, and there's really no.
Yeah.
I mean, you can be part of the best teacher prep program in the
You
world,
can,
and
yep.
you're still going to have
Yeah.
the hardest year of your life, your first year teaching. And it's just how it goes.
I definitely went in with a deficit perspective from the get-go, even though I was telling myself I wasn't. But I'm walking into this school, and it's even embarrassing now to think about it, but I was walking into this school afraid, because I was like, I'm in a public school. Like, these kids, like, they're in gangs, they're in this, like, with all this deficit. And it wasn't until, like, these types of reading starts coming out that you start critically thinking about what your position, even though I'm a Latina, I'm Puerto Rican, I speak Spanish, I speak English, I have all those things in common with them. I did not share a similar socioeconomic background. And that alone was enough for me to just come in not with the best foot forward. And
I mean, I talk about my years of teaching in K-12 as like, man, I think my students like learned in spite of me, usually. Right. And thinking actually in formulating my research and my dissertation and moving forward, I thought a lot about the sort of purported benevolent white educator that, you often, and for me it's white, but I think it's precisely that. There's a lot of ways that multitudes of identities can have sort of historically benefited from structures that become invisible to us, right? And going into that, and I think it really, and I had sort of encountered Anzaldúa and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, another one that y'all need to read.
So good, yeah.
Paulo Freire,
Porteño,
but I hadn't thought about it. But then when I started to, without at the risk of like over dramatizing what it was to like teach in the Bronx, I have vivid memories of like having an amazing class with my students, or like a really fucking frustrating class, but in all of the ways that school is. And then, going onto the subway and seeing, one of my students was suddenly like pushed onto the wall in handcuffs by the police because they like jumped a turnstile. And I'm like, I know this isn't happening at like Columbus Circle. Yeah. That's like around Midtown, New York City, for those of you who aren't like in love with New York City like I am. That's fine. And I think I really gained the framework for understanding a lot of that, and what my role in that was, and what it also meant, how it impacted the way I think about what are the frameworks of thinking and ways of understanding like social and linguistic and cultural dynamics, and especially in relation to education and the histories of teaching and learning that shape how I think about it now. And so I don't know where I was going with that, but
it's,
we were talking about it.
Okay, so I have one more question.
Oh my God,
for you.
has it been 20 minutes or 2 hours? I don't
know. It's been a while, but it's fine. Let's just hope the audio's good.
I know.
Okay, so the last question I have for you, we know that the humanities is unfortunately a field that is constantly being contested. I mean, just look at some of the policies that are being passed in places like, Florida, Texas, etc., etc. And we hear in the news about underfunding and even passing legislations where topics of anti-racism are being banned. Why do we need to advocate for humanities and anti-racist pedagogies?
For the listeners, I'm making a lot of faces right now.
I know, you're like, I'm going to have to zoom on that face.
It's funny. I think I mentioned earlier the sort of identity crisis that comparative literature I learned about goes in. And I think that the humanities sort of goes through a similar one on a regular basis, because the study of the humanities is not necessarily immediately consumable or marketable. And so it's an investment, I mean, to use further language of capital, but it's funny. And one thing I teach my students when I'm teaching, like, Intro to Literary Theory and Criticism of the Field of English and Literature. But there's a wonderful book called The Teaching Archive that looks at the history of teaching, particularly in the field of English, that articulates the difference between English, and I would put this at the humanities as well, is that, let's say, you know, in other kinds of disciplines, like psychology, for example, my amazing and brilliant psychology colleagues, you learn how to do the thing you're studying to do it elsewhere. In English or in literature in the humanities, you're doing it when you are in the classroom.
Yeah.
And that's a radically different act in the world, we could say. And, you know, Audre Lorde famously said poetry is not a luxury. And to me, what that means is literature fundamentally, the study of the humanities, narrative, storytelling, history, is precisely what shapes what we imagine is possible for ourselves, for our futures. It is one of the oldest technologies that we have. Sylvia Wynter calls it, she's a Jamaican playwright and theorist, she calls it homoneurons. We are biologically oriented to use storytelling as a survival and evolutionary metric. And so the humanities get at precisely what, if we can't imagine otherwise, we will always be repeating the same things and structures and ways of knowing and ways of communicating over and over.
Yeah.
And that is the intervention of the humanities, of poetry, of something like Testimonio, which is going to come out and I'm going to break all your damn rules. And because of that, we now have so many more ways of thinking and stories that, you know, our students at Nevada State, who are first generation students of color, can see themselves in. Because once somebody imagined otherwise and insisted on doing that, how do you put that in like a 2-second soundbite for why we have to protect the humanities? And I mean, that goes for the future, but also for understanding the past. I think all too often, you know, and what we see in Florida with this sort of essentially the outlaw of teaching Black history. Ideas have history. Language has history. And you know, I think probably the most key example of that is the use of the N-word, right? But every single framework, why we call something diversity, equity, and inclusion versus anti-racism, anti-white supremacy, you know, being pro-choice versus pro-abortion, right? All of these things, terms have history, and knowing context about something, knowing how to look for context about something is absolutely the way to help us not get lost in like the frenzy of, you know, AI is gonna come and like I know this is like Vanessa's concern.
my God.
Right? Like ChatGPT is not going to come and take over our thinking because it's only ever mimicking the genre of sounding like a particular thing. But like knowing how to know that is what the humanities can give us.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking.
And also I think this is not gonna sound great, but you can really tell when someone has never taken a humanities class.
Well, really,
and you can really tell.
Shows, babes.
It shows because one thing that I think humanities does really well is teach you how to critically think about issues. And by that I don't mean we have to have the same thoughts or the same line of thought, right? No, but we need to to critically think about something. It means you know how to do good research, right? And by good research, it's not Google. You know, like how to...
And knowing if I come across something on Google, do I know how to think like, well, what's the algorithm that got me this hit in the first place?
Yeah.
Like, why are only white male names coming up if I look at, you know, ChatGPT give me, well, it'll just give you made up citations anyway. But like, you know, knowing to be able to see what has been made unseen. And that's critical thinking, I think, to be able to see those questions. And I think creatively as well, because that's the thinking beyond that is actually what makes us. It's at the heart of hope. I'm going to just say that.
Oh, I love that. That's so sweet. Okay, so if our wonderful listeners want to reach you, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Well, I would have said Twitter once upon a time, but
you
I'm
mean
in mourning. I'm in mourning for Twitter, so maybe don't look me up there. But
Threads? No, I downloaded Threads for like a minute, and I was like, no, I can't do more social media.
I know, I have to find it. I mean, so like on social media, I am like at Molly Apple.
Like on
at
Instagram?
Molly __ Apple.
Okay.
And I do check my email, but it is, you know, being faculty senate chair sometimes now means I have like 30 emails a day, and I know. Just to deal with that, I'm like, and no.
Yeah. No,
but yeah, I
think
am
the
on
best,
Twitter. Yeah.
So
or
Twitter or Instagram.
X, whatever we're calling it.
Or put I know, right? Or put the question on the comments, and I'll make sure that she gets them. And she'll reach out to you personally.
I will.
I'll make her.
Vanessa, thank you so much for having me. Big fan.
Oh, you're too
Thank
sweet.
you for doing this podcast.
No,
which I think is like I've been learning so much, and I think just does so much good for just talking about what
we do.
What do we do? What do we do? What does it
Yeah.
look like for us to be doing our things and thinking stuff?
Yeah, and because of this, Molly owes me a invitation to go play Dungeons and Dragons.
That's for another episode.
Maybe we'll do a live stream of that.
Sip and Scholar and
Dungeons Dragons edition.
Snakes. Swords and snakes.
Oh, I like that.
Thank you so much.